And thank you to World Coffee Leaders Forum for inviting me to speak to you here today. So as the introduction said, my name is Chris Ryan, and I'm the editor of Fresh Cup Magazine, a trade publication that's focused on specialty coffee and tea. Primarily, we cover independent retailers, so mostly topics pertinent to coffee shops and tea houses, but we also write about topics throughout those industries. And in having the good fortune to do this job, I have conversations virtually every day with coffee and tea professionals about the many facets of the industries. And those conversations give me a pretty clear window into what's going on with independent coffee businesses, especially at the retail level, both in the US and around the world. So that's what I kind of drew on for this and what I would like to talk to you all about today. I think we'll stick mainly to coffee, but the title of my lecture references the emergence of alternatives, and the main alternative that I want to talk about is tea, which of course is an even older beverage than coffee and certainly a familiar drink in this part of the world. But there have been some exciting things going on with tea in the US in recent months that could affect the global beverage world in the coming years. So we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to start with coffee, and I want to start, as many people have today, by briefly discussing Starbucks. So as I mentioned, Fresh Cup is focused on independence, but we will occasionally cover Starbucks when they do something newsworthy, such as adding new products or announcing new stores. Because the truth is that they are the biggest fish in the pond and in the United States, and there's a trickle-down effect with what they do affecting the independent businesses. So there are currently more than 13,000 Starbucks in the US, and according to analysis firm First Research, there were about 20,000 coffee shops in business in the US in 2011. So even accounting for more non-Starbucks shops opening since 2011, you're still looking at Starbucks making up way more than half of the coffee house market in the US. So anytime that you talk about specialty coffee in the US, Starbucks has the potential to sort of dominate the conversation. But one of the nice things about Starbucks' sort of omnipresence is what you can call the Starbucks effect, which is a raising of awareness about the category of specialty coffee. So while it may seem like independent cafes might be threatened by Starbucks, the truth is that the mainstream acceptance of Starbucks has been a really great thing for these independents because it has made consumers aware of and wanting to consume specialty coffee. And then the ones who are more discerning might seek out the independents because they're often providing a higher quality experience. And here I'd like to talk a little about what characterizes these independent coffee houses that we cover, exactly how they offer that higher quality experience. And I'll mention a term that was just mentioned in the last presentation, third wave, which is a bit of a catch-all term, but an expression that describes the practice of treating coffee like an artisanal product rather than a commodity, really honoring the product from seed to cup. You could say the first wave was previous generations consuming sometimes poor quality, freeze-dried coffee. The second wave might be something like Starbucks, which was better quality but not a ton of craft. And then the third wave is more attention to the details and better quality. So I'll use third wave to refer to this movement I'll be describing. So in talking about third wave, what are some of the characteristics? We're talking about high quality, typically Arabica green coffee to start. And so that starts with the farm where it's sourced from. Third wave cafes use coffee sourced either through an importer or through a roaster directly sometimes, but that sourcer typically has a relationship with the farm or co-op they're buying the coffee from. They'll visit them, they'll know the community, they'll work with the farmer to maintain quality, they'll pay the farmer a fair price. What happens at the farm level is very important for third wave coffee. It all starts with the quality of the coffee being sourced. It is the seed in the seed to cup concept. So once you have that ethically sourced, good quality coffee coming from an identifiable source, then it's expertly roasted, which will be done by a roasting professional whose job it is to bring out the best characteristics out of a specific green coffee. So Starbucks, of course, is known for having a darker roast profile, but in most third wave shops, you're going to find much lighter roasted coffees. And then the preparation is a very important part of it. If you order an espresso drink at a third wave shop, that espresso is ground, tamped, and pulled to order, different from a Starbucks where it's typically an automatic espresso machine that's, the coffee's made at the push of a button. For brewed coffee, you'll see a lot of by-the-cup brew methods. You'll see pour-over bars. A lot of people use the Chemex. Something that's interesting about these is that they aren't new methods. My grandparents could have used a Chemex. It was invented in 1941. But the idea is both the theater in creating this, but also handcrafting something of quality where you control the variables. And that's not to say that batch brewing coffee is bad or that you can't produce quality coffee with it. You'll see lots of third wave shops that are offering batch brew coffee. Some even forgo pour over or a single cup entirely. But many will make most coffees by the cup, but then offer some batch brewed, which sort of gives you the best of both worlds. For customers who are in a hurry, you can serve them quickly. And then the person making this is really important to the process and representative of third wave. And this was discussed by Ellie and David a moment ago. But when we talk about seed to cup, about honoring the producer part, that first step, and a huge way to do that is having a highly trained person who's preparing it carefully and making that coffee taste good. But there is this criticism, particularly in the US cafe culture, that baristas can be snobby, that they're purists, that they're judgmental, that they aren't nice. And certainly I have encountered that at times, so I don't want to say that it's a complete invention. But at the heart of that behavior is, I think, a deep passion for coffee. I was described as geekiness in the previous presentation. And I think that it's beginning to be channeled in a more positive way. I think that people who work in third wave coffee recognize that some sort of bad attitude probably isn't going to spread the message of third wave coffee and make people excited about drinking it. So you kind of have this uptick of good service where the people making your drink are also telling you about the coffee, about the farm where it came from, flavor profiles to look for when you drink it. They can get into a lot of detail if a customer asks for it, but again, a good barista will respond to the interest level of the consumer. The education notion, as discussed, can be kind of a tricky thing if you assume that customers want to hear you lecture them about coffee. But many customers will show an interest, and for those that do, a friendly, educated barista can lead them down the path of discovering coffee. And so I want to talk a bit about that consumer, and I'll do that by talking briefly about the town where I live, which is Portland, Oregon. So Starbucks started in the Northwest, also in Seattle. Portland is about 170 miles to the south of that. And Portland has one of the best specialty coffee cultures in the US, possibly in the world, excelling in this sort of third wave coffee that I've been describing. So Portland is known for being populated with a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of creative people, and people who care a lot about their food. One of the things that Portland has become known for in recent years is an American TV show called Portlandia that has aired for a few seasons. And Portlandia satirizes the obsessiveness that Portlanders have about their interests, about how much they care about things, whether it's food, coffee, the environment, what have you. But while this show is set in Portland, I think part of the reason for its success and why it continues to be renewed and why it resonates with people is that it's kind of indicative of how the US culture is changing. I think you could point at many major metropolitan cities and see a Portlandification, for lack of a better word, whether that's in the nationwide growth of natural food grocery stores like Whole Foods that demonstrate a willingness in consumers to buy local food, or in environmentally minded behaviors. To give a cafe example, you have customers buying reusable cups like the Keep Cup that they can take with them each time that they go to a shop so that they aren't contributing paper cups to landfills. So this kind of behavior indicates that people are caring more not just about what goes into their bodies, but about how their consuming behaviors affect the planet. It's definitely more concentrated, maybe more exaggerated in Portland, which is why Portlandia makes fun of it, because it's an easy target. But there is definitely a movement that way in the US. And I think a big reason for that shift is the generation that's coming of age now, which is the millennials. So there's been some research done in the US about the millennial generation, the age of which can vary pretty dramatically, but it's pretty much if you're born between the early 1980s and the early 2000s. So these people are currently between the age of maybe 32 at the oldest, maybe 12 at the youngest. So the oldest in this generation have developed as consumers. The younger ones are continuing to develop. So the way that this generation behaves and what is important to them is kind of an important window to consumer behavior, because these are your current buyers. And they care about a lot of this stuff that I've mentioned. There's a good article in QSR last year about millennials that was called Fulfilling Generation Next, that highlights 4 of what they call culinary characteristics of millennials. So you can see some of them among here. So one is they hanker for authentic diversity. So they're interested in trying products from around the world, but they want them to be prepared well and to be the best possible representation of that product. And then another one size definitely will not fit all, which means they don't want to patronize chain businesses if they can avoid it. They definitely are drawn toward independent businesses. And then they wear their social consciences on their sleeves. So they care about where their product came from, and they care about how the products that they consume were made. And so third wave coffee hits a lot of these things that are important to millennials. Authentically diverse, independent businesses, you can trace it back to the source, to the farmer. And while Starbucks is still going to succeed in the US in part because its brand is so well known and they've carved out such a big role in the culture, there's a huge window open for this third wave coffee that I think is going to widen even more as these millennials mature and become consumers. And so Starbucks is definitely aware of this third wave behavior. In fact, a couple of months ago, the news broke that the Clover, which is a single cup brewer that Starbucks bought 5 years ago, rolled out to 500 of their stores. They announced that they're going to be adding it to 500 more stores to showcase this reserve coffee line that's sort of one of their upscale lines. So they certainly see this theater element is something that customers want. And so some of their stores reflect that. But if you're talking about 1,000 Starbucks, that's a very small fraction of Starbucks. So for the most part, Starbucks is built for rushes, to push a button to give you your coffee, and you can stay for a while, but definitely more on the rush side, rush environment, whereas the third wave shops are more of a venue to talk to you about the coffee while it's made by hand. We're connecting it back to the farmer and hopefully get you invested in the product a little bit. And while we're talking about the US cafe trends, I'd like to talk about a couple more and sort of what they say about consumers. One is the multiple roaster format in cafes. The shop credited with starting this, perhaps not surprisingly, since we're talking about Portland as a sort of epicenter, is called Barista, that's located in Portland. And so the multiple roaster format is different from the sort of traditional cafe setup. For a cafe that doesn't roast its own beans, traditionally would use coffee from one roaster to have a sort of partnership. And in the multiple roaster situation, a cafe uses beans from a few different roasters, not unlike a bar would serve beer from a few different breweries. So what's neat about this for a consumer is you can go into a coffee shop and you can satisfy your curiosity by trying a few different roasters' style of their take on coffee, what they do with the coffee. And it's neat because that sort of generates this excitement in consumers that didn't exist before. This format didn't exist before, and it's helping to cultivate that interest. And in the US, it's a growing model. You're seeing this in a lot more shops that are opening up as multiple roaster shops. And then another coffee consuming trend that I wanted to cover is the idea of paying more for quality. And this price-quality relationship was also discussed a little bit in the last talk, but I wanted to talk about a cafe in Washington, D.C. called the Y Down that recently opened that is another multiple roaster cafe. serves coffee from a few different roasters, and what they're doing is not necessarily unique to them, but still a fairly novel concept. So as you can see in this picture of the menu here, it's a little grainy, but they're charging different prices for different coffees, and they're drawing a line between what they paid for the coffee and what they're charging for it. I can still remember 8 or 9 years ago going to Stumptown in Portland, which is one of the first sort of third wave roasters, and you know, they did all their coffee in a French press, and you give them just $1 or $2 and they'll give you your coffee, but everything, no matter what they were serving that day, was the same price. So what this does is, with this menu, they're saying, here are a few coffees, they're almost all sort of priced differently based on what we paid for the coffee, and also because of some, you know, agricultural factors that led to that price. And then in this example, you see the one on the left is a geisha that's $9.25 because it's a special coffee. And so shops that are doing this are explaining to customers the reason that they're asking more. In the case of the geisha, it's a rare, limited supply coffee. There aren't many trees of the geisha variety out there, and those geisha trees produce far fewer cherries than the average coffee tree. So a shop like the Y-Down is communicating the story of this coffee, and they're communicating that, and they're paralleling it with other great taste experiences. So asking something like $9.25 is not far from what you might pay in the US for a good glass of wine. And so it's kind of bringing value to the coffee, and if you're asking customers to pay more for it, sort of explaining the reason why by telling that story. And sort of one of the good news things about this is, with this particular story, the Y-Down sold out of this geisha coffee quickly, you know, so that tells me that this is working, that customers are drawing a line between quality and price. And so talking about some of these cafe trends, I'd like to point out, that this third wave style of coffee is growing. In Portland, I could give examples of, well, Barista that I just mentioned started their first location in 2009, now has 4 locations. There are many shops that have sprouted up that have then added more locations, cafes and roasters. But then you're seeing third wave coffee breaking out all over the country as well. So I mentioned Stumptown Coffee. Just a couple months ago, Stumptown opened in Los Angeles. It was its 4th market. They started in Portland, went to Seattle, went to New York City, and now they're in Los Angeles. And as they've done with all the other markets that they're in, they built a roastery there so that they have fresh coffee nearby, and they can also market it as a local product, which is also important to consumers. And so this dissemination of good coffee into other US markets, I think, is worth sort of bringing attention to. Los Angeles is just kind of the most recent US city that's kind of exploding. A couple more roasters that are based in Northern California area. One is called Blue Bottle, it's kind of internationally known, and Verve is another. Both of them are opening in Los Angeles in 2014. And then there are I mentioned that multiple roaster format, several of those kind of shops in Los Angeles, including this one, Cognoscenti Coffee. And then another giant cafe scene in the US that's really emerged in the last 5 years or so is New York City. And so not surprisingly, when you talk about New York City, you talk about Los Angeles, these are giant markets, more than 8 million in New York, almost 4 million in Los Angeles. And in New York, you've again had roasters enter the scene from out of town. I mentioned Stumptown going there. Another is Toby's Estate Coffee, based in Sydney, Australia. They opened a roastery in Brooklyn at the start of last year, and they now have 2 locations there. And so with these giant markets like New York and LA, they've always been huge population centers, but now third wave coffee is kind of on the radar of the consumers there. And so it represents a huge opportunity for roasters and cafes that a lot of them are taking advantage of. But talking about this style of coffee in the US, it's not just Portland, it's not just the New Yorks and the Los Angeleses where things are sort of taking off. Pretty much every major metropolitan city has exciting things going on in coffee. A couple other examples, I mentioned Washington, D.C. and the Y-Down, Austin, Texas. Both of those are a couple of cities with amazing roasters and cafes, multiple roaster method style shops. The World Barista Champion currently reigning is from Kansas City, Missouri, which is in the middle of the country, the 37th biggest population in the United States, so definitely not a big city there. And then we ran this story last year in Fresh Cup Best of the Boonies that looked at some towns in North Carolina, Oregon, Michigan. These were not huge cities, but just these sort of little wrinkles where really good coffee is showing up. You know, coffee that is sourced ethically, that's brewed using high quality methods by a barista interested in talking to the customer, you know, all these third wave concepts that we've kind of hit on. And then another example of this sort of spreading of this is beyond the cafes. You're seeing third wave ideas kind of move into a couple of bigger stages. One is airports. Klatch Coffee is a roaster in Southern California that opened a location about a year ago at Los Angeles International Airport. And then Terminal D at LaGuardia in New York City has World Bean, which has coffees from several high-end roasters. A different example is Petco Park, which is where the San Diego Padres Major League Baseball team plays. They brought in a local San Diego roaster called Bird Rock last year. So in all these cases, you have these bigger companies that are in charge of bringing in vendors, and they're recognizing that they want to up their game. They want to have high-quality businesses in there providing food and drink that are also local. And so third wave coffee is on the radar of these guys, and so these sorts of businesses are showing up there. And then the last example I think of third wave sort of being everywhere in the US is that people are making this stuff at home in really big numbers. Recent years has seen the rise of the home coffee enthusiast. And so these guys are using really good brew methods at home, whether they have a home espresso machine or one of these brewers that I mentioned. They have digital scales to weigh the grounds. They have burr grinders. And most importantly, they're buying good coffee. When I was a kid, my parents would say they're going to buy a pound of coffee at the grocery store. A pound is, of course, 16 ounces. For this current wave of great coffee, the bags are usually 12 ounces. And if you go to a grocery store like the aforementioned Whole Foods, the price is going to be probably between $12 and $17. Coffee will typically have a lot of information about where it came from. If it's a single origin coffee from one farm, it'll tell you about the farm, the altitude, tasting notes of what you can expect. It'll also have the date that it was roasted on there. And so, you know, informed consumers will check that date to make sure that they're getting a fresh coffee. And so this model is something that's working for US consumers. They'll gladly pay these prices, take their coffee home, and make it at home. In Portland, we even have a couple of coffee stores, not coffee shops, but stores that are specifically catering to the home user. There's this one called Clive Coffee that sells grinders and espresso machines and pour over and other brew methods, wide selection of whole bean coffee. So what this says about consumers that's interesting to me is that they may not want to or be able to go to a coffee shop every day, but they want to drink that caliber of coffee every day. So they aren't making possibly, you know, pre-ground or inferior quality coffee at home on an old brewer. The quality is important to them no matter where they are. So that was kind of talking about third wave in the US and sort of the growth of it. And now I'd like to talk about third wave sort of beyond that and travel the globe a little bit briefly here, stopping in Latin America. And so Medellin is marked on the map here, and we'll get to that in a moment. But so historically, Latin American countries have exported their best coffee to countries like the US or the United Kingdom or South Korea to get a higher price for it. But we're seeing more instances of third wave culture showing up in producing countries. One thing that was neat, the World Barista Championship, which crowns the best, best barista in the world. There's more than 50 countries that take part. In 2011, for the first time, a producing country won. It was Alejandro Mendez representing Viva Espresso, which is a third wave shop in El Salvador. And then the next year, it happened again when Raul Rodas of Paradigma in Guatemala won. So definitely showing that origin countries were mastering the kind of final step in the seed to cup process as good as anyone, though when they're, of course, known for the seed part traditionally. And so I suppose it's not surprising that in other examples we would see this third wave emergence in the biggest producing countries down there, where the government strongly supports the industry and coffee is the huge part of the country's identity. Brazil is one example, and then another is Colombia, and that's what I'd like to discuss for a minute. It was about a year ago. I was in Medellin and visited a shop called Pergamino, and that just opened last year. But it's a shop that could be situated in the U.S. in Portland, and fit right in. You know, the manual brew method, knowledgeable baristas, a lot of these other things we talked about with third wave shops. What's interesting to me about a third wave shop existing in origin countries is that they have the chance to highlight local coffees. Most of us don't have the luxury of saying, or we can't tell a customer this coffee was, you know, this amazing coffee was grown a few hours from here in the mountains. But when you can do that, it, you know, helps consumers connect with what they're drinking because it actually is a local product. So when I visited Pergamino last year, they had a couple of Ethiopian coffees, and then they had a couple of Colombian coffees they were serving right next to it. So serving some of these best coffees from all over the world lets the person drinking it realize, like, oh, this local coffee is it ranks among the best in the entire world. And so this shop has been open for just a little bit over a year, but I had a conversation today confirming that it's kind of a novel concept there when it opened, but it's really resonating with people and they're having really good growth. And so shifting gears a little bit, another stop I wanted to make was Melbourne, Australia, where I think a lot of people probably in this room were earlier this year for the World Barista Championship. So jumping back to the Portland comparison, Melbourne isn't too far from that in that they really, really take their coffee seriously and that it fits into a highly developed food culture that they have. A few things that were impressive to me about Melbourne that are different from the US, actually representative of Australia as a whole, is that this is a place where independent cafes thrive. So Starbucks tried to open in Australia in 2000. They opened 84 stores, and they closed 61 of them in 2008. So according to this IBIS World Cafes and Coffee Shops in Australia market research report, there are about 6,500 cafes in Australia. 95% of them are independent. So you have your few Starbucks, you have your Gloria Jeans, and a couple other chains, but the vast majority are independent. So Australia is an independent-based cafe culture, and Melbourne is kind of ground zero for great cafes. Talking to people when I was there, they say because there are so many independent roasters competing for each cafe's business, they keep having to improve quality, better training, better equipment, better coffee. And the consumer in turn gets educated and smart and discerning because they have such great options. I interviewed this guy, Nolan, who owns a third wave roaster retailer there called Proud Mary, who told me that his customers will line up to pay $10 for a geisha. So that's a clear parallel with the Y Down offering, asking $9.25 for a geisha, and customers drinking it all up quickly. Now, something else about Australia that's interesting is that it was primarily an espresso culture until just a few years ago. Now filtered coffee is starting to catch on there, but it's different from somewhere like the US where coffee was kind of always, batch brewed coffee was kind of always a fact of life. It wasn't always good quality. That didn't exist there. If you wanted coffee in Australia, it was probably espresso that you were getting. And so when they went to build their batch brew, their filtered coffee concept, it was kind of from scratch, and it's single cup and it's good quality. This photo that's here is from a shop I stopped at in Melbourne that was called Seven Seeds. The coffee was made on an AeroPress. It came with this card with all the information about the coffee, the producer, the altitude, the varietal. So even though hearing that filter coffee is growing in Melbourne, espresso is still by far the dominant drink. Talking to this guy Nolan at Proud Mary, giving me the example of their shop, he told me they'll do 30 cups of filtered coffee a day as opposed to 800 or 900 cups of espresso. So that is a huge difference. And then one more stop on the global tour, and that's here in Asia. In the March issue of Fresh Cup, we did a special section about the Asian coffee culture, and I wrote an article about China, which is a vast nation, according to the 2010 census, 1.34 billion people, and the world's fastest growing economy, and throwing Starbucks in there again, set its sights there, hoping to hit 1,500 stores by 2015, as we heard earlier today, and that would make it the second biggest market behind the US. So at this year's SCAA conference in Boston, Al Liu from Atlas Coffee gave this speech about the Asian coffee market, and he mentioned the money factor as being one of the main reasons for Asia's growing coffee market. With economies booming in many Asian countries, personal income is higher than it ever was before, which leads to more consumer spending. And many younger people in Asian urban centers see specialty coffee as being kind of hip and trendy and cool, and it leads to them sort of visiting shops and spending their money there. And of course, being in Seoul, actually in that section there was also an article about the coffee culture in South Korea. And after just arriving last night, but obviously have seen already that there are so many shops on every street. And so this article from last year, or from this year, talked about this Reuters report from earlier this year that said the number of coffee shops in South Korea increased tenfold from 2006 to 2011, that there are now more than 12,000 retail outlets in the country, which is a number that's on par with the United Kingdom, but that's a country with 12 million more people. So really rapid growth. And the cafe landscape in South Korea is definitely chain-driven. The story we published said that there are more than 50 coffee chains here with more than 100 stores. And again, talking about Starbucks, they have more than 400 locations with plans to get to 700 by 2016. But there are, of course, a lot of independents too, especially in Seoul, where we're definitely seeing instances, a lot of instances of that third wave culture that I discussed. And you talk about something like Cup of Excellence, where a jury decides the top quality coffees for a specific country, and then those coffees are auctioned off at typically pretty high prices. South Korean roasters have commonly been among the top bidders for those in recent years. In 2012, the Guatemalan coffee farm El Injerto, which is a coveted coffee producer, did its auction, and it was a Seoul-based micro roaster. Brian Kim paid more than $500 a pound for one 8-pound lot. And in these situations, it's a really good marketing opportunity for a roaster to buy a really expensive coffee like that, because you get international attention where people say, wow, they paid a lot of money for that coffee. It must be really good. That roaster must be doing a really good job. So definitely saw instances of that here. And so I'd like to shift gears a little bit now and talk about tea for a few minutes. And as the thing said at the beginning in the title, the alternative, the emergence of alternatives, the big alternative to coffee that I'd like to discuss is tea. And we'll talk last time, I think, about Starbucks. So in coffee shops, tea is, of course, not a new beverage. According to this guy, Brian Keating, who publishes a report called Specialty Tea is Hot, 95% of US coffee shops serve tea. How the tea is served will vary wildly, as will the quality of it. Some shops will hand you a traditional tea bag and some hot water. Others will use the pyramid sachets, which are the bigger tea bags with more room for the leaves to unfurl, generally thought to be higher quality. And then the next rung up the quality spectrum would be up the quality ladder would be loose leaf service, where they present you with the tea steeping in a pot. You can pour from there, a bit more of a high-end experience. So though coffee has had a lot more presence than tea in many markets, definitely in the US, the truth is that tea is a giant beverage in the world, a $90 billion global category, twice the size of coffee, if you consider both hot tea and iced tea. And so Starbucks, where they come in, is that they're sort of entering the specialty tea picture as of recently. About a year ago, they bought Teavana, which is a mall-based chain in the US that primarily sold dry tea for people to take home and brew. They bought it, they revamped the brand, and then last month they debuted Teavana Fine Teas and Tea Bar in New York City. So it's a new concept. They still have the dry tea bar. They also have a separate bar where they make tea drinks, including specialty tea lattes. And Starbucks announced that they're rolling out a bunch of these, 1,000 US locations in the next 5 years. And before that rollout is complete, they'll go international. Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz said they'll possibly be opening in Asia in the next couple of years. And And so what that means is basically a new style of tea house. In the US, most tea rooms are either Asian-inspired or British-inspired. So Starbucks is sort of going to try to create the American tea house, basically the Starbucks of tea. And Howard Schultz has even said this, that in the next 5 to 10 years, they hope to do for tea what they did for coffee. So with Starbucks having the potential to raise awareness about tea the way that they did for coffee, this could directly benefit these third wave independents. I mean, you're already seeing third wave coffee houses take their tea seriously, and you're going to see them up their game even more, presumably, as there's more awareness around it and demand for it. And a good example to give is Intelligentsia Coffee and Tea, which is one of the best-known third-wave U.S. roasters. Intelligentsia has always done a really great job with its tea service and its cafes, serving loose leaf and teapots and doing a great job with the presentation, sourcing and brewing it in a similar manner to how they do their coffee. But Intelligentsia has become very well known for its coffee, and it kind of overshadowed what they were doing on the tea side. And so earlier this year, Intelligentsia launched Kilogram Tea, which is essentially a new company that's concentrating on tea. So one reason that they launched it was to take it away from under the umbrella where it wasn't getting as much attention. But then the other reason was to sort of bring an American identity to tea because they saw a market for it. And I talked to the director of tea, Doug Pallas, and you can see his quote there that he thinks that there will be a big U.S. market for tea in the years to come. So it's interesting that it's pretty similar to what Starbucks has just done, coming at it from an entirely different angle, but both are seeing an American audience for tea and behaving accordingly. And so you can ask, why tea? And it's another, like coffee, another high quality or agricultural product you can source that's consumed in a retail, especially retail shop. The way that we talk about getting obsessed with the details of a coffee, you can immerse yourself in similar details with tea, and the theater of brewing applies to tea as well. And then also, if we go back to that QSR article I mentioned at the start, number 3 of what's on the list of what's important to millennials and their culinary characteristics was they're health conscious yet prone to fits of decadent eating. So tea is certainly discussed as a good for you item, and it also tastes great. So it seems well positioned to resonate with those millennials who are becoming consumers now. And it also hits some of the other things on that list, like those consumers favoring independent businesses and wanting to know where their products come from. And so I checked in with some of those countries that I mentioned on where tea is for them. And so perhaps not surprisingly, what they're doing sort of corresponds with how developed the cafe culture is. At Pergamino in Medellin, Colombia, he told me that they're more coffee focused, but they do have a handful of tea offerings, and the ones that they offer are all made in a French press, so there's still a craft in how they're making it. And then in Melbourne, as you might imagine from the hyper-developed cafe culture and food and drink obsession, they take tea very seriously as well. I talked to this guy, Nathan Wakeford, who has a tea bar there called Thiek. They have 33 teas that they offer. They will use different teaware depending on the tea that's being brewed. They offer tasting cards with all the information the same way that I showed that 7 Seeds one. And he told me that one of the cafes in Melbourne that he supplies with tea, it's called Monk Bodhi Dharma, some days up to 40% of their beverage sales are tea. So 40% for what would be a coffee shop is a huge number. So specialty tea can be a pretty huge part of the menu there. And then in South Korea, that article that I mentioned that appeared in Fresh Cup earlier this year discussed that specialty tea is also playing a bigger role here too. Tea has always, of course, been consumed here as well, but now maybe a little bit better quality to match the high-end coffees being brought in. To offer one example, there's a New York City-based tea bar called Tavalon that now has 2 retail shops in Seoul. And Tavalon's owner, John Paul Lee, said in that article that it's a younger demographic that's coming in there, largely those under 30 who are accounting for most of their business. So with the tea as the emerging alternative, it will be interesting to see what happens going forward and how Starbucks' new Teavana stores impact the sort of global tea scene. And what's more, whether a raised awareness about tea translates to consumer behavior at coffee shops, whether they order more tea. So as mentioned, Teavana, it is a US-style tea house starting in America, but Starbucks has a habit of exporting its models and having major global influence, and they've already said that they're going international, likely to Asia, so that could have implications globally going forward. And so I think that pretty much concludes what I was going to say. Just to recap a few points, we have third wave coffee really staking out a place in the United States, offering a product that has been handled with care from seed to cup, prepared carefully to deliver a fantastic taste experience, and presented by people who are telling the story of the coffee. And this is spreading throughout the country and now throughout the world. And then helping to spur that growth is that millennial who is your young consumer now and will be the demographic becoming a consumer in the coming years. They have tastes that are in line with specialty beverages like third wave coffee and specialty tea, and through their habits they will likely continue to spur the growth of those beverages. And then lastly, specialty tea has the potential to be an even more important drink in the cafe world, helped by that huge push from Starbucks that should steer it more directly into the public consciousness. It's already a staple of most coffeehouse menus, but it's going to be an even more important alternative to coffee on those menus as an appreciation of specialty tea grows among consumers. So thank you again to World Coffee Leaders Forum for inviting me here, and thanks to all of you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan.